just to re-emphasize the main themes, or at least the salient ideological points, I guess, that essentially if the system as it exists is so corrupt that there effectively is so little of a free press that is available to people, that perhaps it is worth it that there be hardwired into the system a kind of a substantive platform of opposing ideological or dialectical forum for hashing out um, policy debate. Uh, and something like a shadow Congress would perhaps be that kind of solution, which obviously in the interim of a reform that sort of hardwires a kind of an incentivized policy debate that is meant to go into different aspects. Perhaps, because a shadow Congress or a shadow Parliament could give itself the leeway to do the legwork that is otherwise not possible to do, to sort of to go under the covers of some issue, to sort of to go to see how deep the rabbit hole is, and they have the kind of the political capital in order to expend to do that, because they're on the sidelines, as it were. Um, and then obviously it would kind of be in the tradition of a kind of, in the same way that in the legal system you have an adversarial system, and then the adjudicator is the judge. That that it would be, the shadow Congress would be manned by partisans, effectively, um, political partisans, um, perhaps giving each other structures and leeway to develop their arguments so that they can be better, sort of uh, better surmounted as deep ideological clashes. I mean, the kind of work that is missing, which I think even Bret Weinstein is sort of looking past with his Unity 2020, is, oh yeah, I mean, this is actually an issue that I should touch on by itself, is that I don't think it's a simple matter of getting one person from the right and one person from the left and them merely being patriotic, that they can somehow create workable policy. I think that the left and the right are fundamentally in, and I mean this in the best sense possible, that they have a fundamental disagreement, and in some sense, the problems that the left wants to address are problems that the right would prefer to go unanswered, and prefer for them to even be problems, because without having those issues, without people being plagued by those issues, if people are saved from those problems, that it is a mark against people's character, that it is a true reflection of someone's lack of responsibility, or someone's inability to coordinate, or to, like in some sense, it's like it's an untapped market. But, well, it's a combination of being an untapped market for someone to actually, create a model of some kind of collaboration or coordination in the private sector, which might not necessarily be a business venture in the private sector, but might be a kind of a freedom of association, a kind of, well, if people don't wish to um, corroborate or coordinate in a kind of in a kind of in a natural institution, or a if they're not willing to develop the kind of a community culture, or they're not willing to sort of to fashion the solution to that problem, perhaps it's not for the government to solve that problem. In some sense, I mean, from a kind of Republican, or at least conservative right wing sort of historical perspective, you can see that essentially the problem of government, or the problem of big government, started when after World War II, um, people didn't have their affairs set up, and there was a kind of usually what would have filled the gap, the charity that would have filled the gap, was overwhelmed by the fact that this was a kind of that there was a kind of there was an aftermath of kind of human carnage in some sense, that things were in such disarray because of the death toll from the world wars, that or at least from the Second World War, that people died and there wasn't the resources to bury them or to deal with the funeral, and so that became a kind of some kind of government policy, that became some kind of, and therefore the kind of the paternalism of big government was sort of was generated in the minds of the populace by that kind of, sort of the cradle to grave sort of conception of government. And that really made culture no longer the province of the kind of the individual private sphere, but somewhat subordinated the private sphere to a kind of governmental paternalism. And it has been that sentiment which has metastasized and undercut, let's say, the classical liberal ethos, and now, sort of it's sort of come to its head in the kind of in the arguments of systemic oppression and the complaints of systemic oppression. You can track that same theme as metastasizing, and so in some sense, from the right perspective, or from the right's perspective, from the conservative standpoint, perhaps it is right that people should be saddled with a kind of burden, because that shows a niche in the market, that shows a level of ingenuity on the level of culture that needs to be produced, that someone actually has to invent that, or it's representative of of a collective ill which could be solved but for the lack of community coordination, the lack of private innovation, as it were. And in some sense, if people aren't capable of that innovation, perhaps they don't deserve to profit by a kind of, in some sense, this is the kind of, that when you are, I mean, there are parallels to this, but, it's sort of like when your technological abilities surpass your humanity, and your sort of, that, that we don't have the wisdom essentially to deal with the nuclear bomb. In some sense, when the left wants to sort of solve problems, they are further arresting us in the development of our humanity, because they are infantilizing culture in some sense. They're essentially reducing us to a kind of utilitarian equation, to be infantilized, or that we are entitled to that utilitarian sort of formulation, and they don't let us suffer the problems of our sort of arrested development in terms of developing, kind of, anyway. So and the idea that sort of you can put the cart before the horse, that essentially, well, if you just feed people this kind of this weird kind of ideological framework that, well, if they were just treated in a more maximizing utilitarian, sort of formula, that then the dignity that sort of would correspond to that level of being would manifest organically, or something like that. That essentially the problem the problem that everyone has is just they don't have enough access to resources, and they just don't have enough money thrown at them, which sort of completely undermines, sort of the idea of. I mean, again, I see this. The problem with that kind of ideological framework at the end of the day is that it always kind of impoverishes the importance of self ownership and self determinism. that is always just kind of that always takes a back seat, that is always put on the back burner. Um, that's a sort of a symptom of some kind of reductive sort of. I mean, in some sense, I think that these things also the true synthesis to this conundrum that I have just uttered is to wed these things to be simultaneous. That essentially that there's a kind of I mean, people I guess could say that it would be a kind of a heartless kind of to make it into a kind of game, but where essentially you force a kind of trade-off, that you sort of you have a kind of welfare that is wedded to a particular kind of trade-off, so that you know essentially that you can't ignore the fact that essentially your self-ownership is also being rehabilitated in your connection to a policy. So you receive a benefit of a policy as part of a kind of rehabilitative sort of process. And so it's sort of, it cleans up after itself in terms of the kind of this otherwise sort of ethical paradox that you throw people into, and in some sense you end up putting all the pressure in terms of the ethical responsibility on the system for not having already provided it, in which case you circumvent the development of self-ownership and self-determinism, and that aspect never gets rehabilitated. That needs to be part of the central sort of calculus of how policy works, to intervene in inverted commas, because otherwise you don't actually have sort of tangible progress. You just have a kind of weird kind of ideological reductive framework that sort of actually makes all progress sort of contingent and artificial on the kind of on on keeping up the kind of utilitarian entitlement that has been sort of reductively correlated to a monitoring or an or a kind of as a litmus test for the kind of the dignity which is owed you by the system in some sense, and therefore as a dependent on that utilitarian dispensation, one is then fundamentally a slave um, to that entitlement, to the source of that entitlement. And you essentially you lose your sovereignty as a liberal, as a classically liberal member of a democracy. Essentially you lose your I mean you essentially are diluting or divesting your dignity and sort of dispersing it amongst some kind of that, whatever that reduction is, that sort of made that disgusting sort of equivalency, which I'm afraid that even I see Bret is prone to that, to using those tests and using those kinds of equivalencies, because it is so sort of it is kind of intellectually sympathetic to essentially not shining the light on people's essentially their perhaps willful and self self I can't think of the word, but the self undermining process of deferring the development of self ownership and self determinism, and that is an ongoing process. That essentially, if that is not made one of the central pieces of the rehabilitation puzzle, it becomes essentially an endless cycle. Um, anyway, and in some sense, I mean, I feel like I'm making the same complaint on multiple levels. I'm making this complaint on the level of left ideology in general, in some sense, and how it undermines. I mean, I consider myself a Marxist analyst, and I also consider myself a left Marxist, as in a libertarian Marxist. Obviously, I don't believe in revolution. I don't believe in revolting against the state. Um, I believe that if I do believe that essentially capitalism does have to reach its end, but I don't think that it should end. It should not be overthrown. It should actually be preserved as the default system. It should be displaced by private cooperation and freedom of association in the container. Because in some sense, how would you, in some sense, I think that the only way to overcome private property, as it were, is by developing ulterior systems that have to be developed organically and that can essentially only be developed not via the transaction of a kind of a revolutionary takeover, but via a voluntary development. And in some sense, I think that it is important that the revolution, in my conception of it, buy its freedom from the market and develop organically, as it were. Um, I mean, before you actually had to, if you wanted to revolt, you actually had to do things. Um, if you wanted to live a different way of life, you actually had to do quite radical things. That's not so in a liberal, democratic, Western political ethos. You don't have to do any of that stuff. You could just get on with it. Just if you want to live differently, get on with it. Do it, and don't complain that you can't, that you're not allowed to essentially use compulsion and to unilaterally why must revolution only happen essentially at the same time that there's essentially rioting and looting or something like that to facilitate some kind of massive transfer of wealth, um, which is often going to people that don't even know how to manage anything. They don't even know how anything works, unless they can command other people to do it. It just shows the kind of the impoverished ethical character generally of those sorts of revolution, that they are so feeble and two-dimensional. They're essentially a kind of a cardboard cutout of a kind of a humanity that is so badly, sort of. Anyway, let me not go into down this tangent, but yeah. So let me just move on. Okay, so yeah, those themes, I guess now I've covered those fully. The other thing to just re-emphasize again is that I mean, I think it's actually a good thing that tech companies and the mainstream media are so obviously corrupt, because that gives you all the more impetus to create an alternative platform or an alternative forum of communication on serious matters. That we have all this technology available in terms of creating systems of coordination. Obviously structure is important. You having the possibility of freedom and, let's say, actualizing it is a sort of different thing. And actually developing a structure that is capable of embodying fidelity and trust, and that is capable of sort of coordinating sophisticated levels of deliberation of issues. I mean, you think you can do better than these things that you're criticizing, but there's a lot of, because even if within a group of people, even within a relatively large group of people, if you can derive a kind of sophisticated consensus, how good are you at communicating that? How good are you at sort of um, at essentially promoting um, messages and communicating messages. I mean, it might you might actually find that culture sometimes gets into such a state, and people's, you know, sort of the critical mass of the zeitgeist and such gets in is such a fickle and sort of feeble and superficial, you know, sort of waves of. I mean, we've obviously regressed horribly. I mean, identity politics has really making made culture go backwards, to a large extent. You know, it's incredibly infantile. It's incredibly immature. Uh, you know, it's both incredibly deranged emotionally and you know and psychologically, while also, you know, the kind of the pretentious pseudo intellectualism that sort of tries to mask that, you know, quite sort of pathetic demeanor of a essentially personality disordered, you know, sort of individual. Um, you know, I mean, you just see like how it's possible for these sorts of entities to be a kind of cultural hegemon. Uh, I mean, in some sense, I think a lot of this is happening because the age of communication via electronic mediums of peer to peer sort of communication, that there's a level of psychological nakedness which is capable of being transmitted as never before. Before, it was always sort of like a celebrity or writing sitcoms, you know, sort of, you know, American television, um, that was a set of characters which were known generally to everyone, whereas now that class of show of being exhibited to the masses is uh, much more disparate, is much less uniform, um, and so, you know, I mean, you know, I can try to illustrate this in another way. I mean, the problem is that when platforms stop becoming sort of icons, um, grand, centralizing, centrifugal forces of culture, we are not having dreams about similar themes because of the lack of common cultural um, artifacts in some sense. Artifact is kind of the wrong word that I want, but essentially we're not having the same cultural experience in the same kind of synchronous way that we used to have. Um, it's much more um, dynamic, um, and that creates a kind of a within at least a certain section of the population with a certain kind of psychological profile that creates, I must say, and this section of the population that I'm talking about has always been unhinged. This creates a kind of a new a new precarious social environment for these people who have always been naturally status seeking, and they have always tried to obtain high status through a kind of pseudo intellectualism. And essentially, when we've had more stable cultural um, artifacts and a framework, they were able to kind of use those sort of anchor points and those icons to concoct a level of sort of social manipulation and um, to construct a kind of a stable soapbox to sort of advance themselves and their project of sort of field marshalling in terms of some kind of cultural theme that they could project themselves as being on the cutting edge of, or at least in being necessary in sort of policing and guarding some inner sanctum of some kind of high status against other people who were in a different camp. You know, it's kind of like when you have competing mafias that are competing on the level of territory, and if they have stable territories, then they can each sell protection to their own in-group territory quite stably, and they can use that to make themselves feel important and necessary. But then when you're in this kind of cultural zeitgeist, which is no longer, let's say, a kind of singular medium, the territories are no longer very well demarcated. They're kind of in a kind of, they're much smaller, each of them. And so then they're much more insecure. And so you have these people that are trying to sell protection to people, but there's no, the rules of the game have changed. The rules of how territory is divvied up is unstable. And so what we're seeing is this group of people who are feeling very insecure in terms of their social status, in terms of their high social status, which they are used to kind of parasitically accessing, and by leveraging cultural artifacts to essentially construct a narrative in which that they could be a very important sort of field marshal, or at least designate themselves as fulfilling that role, and essentially selling protection to their in-group. Very sort of corrosive, judgmental, sadistically edged. It's a kind of concealed cerebral sadism in some sense. Perhaps you could link it up with maybe some notions of sort of covert narcissism and things like that, and other perhaps elements of what I've described as cerebral histrionics. But anyway, I don't want to get into that tangent. But essentially, what we see in identity politics, to some extent, is a generalized expression of the themes of how they operate, because in some sense they've had to rely on an overarching narrative in order to try to recoup the kind of centralized culture that was stable enough and that was predictable enough for them to essentially game. And I think that a lot of this kind of pseudo-intellectualism was vested into politics, because politics was an esoteric enough sort of peripheral aspect. Um, these people, they exist in everything. I mean, it's not just sort of in politics. I guess they can, they can, they're almost like natural tribalists. They're sort of, I would call them natural fascists in some sense, and they can disguise their in-group, sort of, they're essentially, they're always selling themselves as kind of the solution to a problem, I mean, you see this in the kind of in the race baiting stuff. Um, these individuals exist in every subculture. I've always said that these people, in some sense, you can almost predict that they will control a culture unless they are cultural forces that directly suppress their values and directly suppress how they behave and how they operate. That essentially anything that can be taken over will be taken over by them unless there are institutional safeguards essentially keeping these people out because of their essentially their sort of their fundamental sort of bad faith. They're almost like a weird kind of natural sophist, but their sophistry is more around sort of creating a stable racket. Anyway, and they often create very toxic sort of memes that are useful for other people who are maybe sort of not as bad faith as they are, but which end up trafficking in their products because they have such stable currency in the culture. But now that essentially, I mean, perhaps it's a natural process that they have essentially created a macro overarching sort of narrative, and that has sort of also to people that are more perceptive and critical of their raw power grab, that then essentially the rudiments of their trickery and of their game is now coming to the fore. Um, so anyway, basically my point is that you can now see how these people operate writ large through sort of identity politics. Um, but they have existed before identity politics, and they have often embedded themselves in an even way throughout anything that can be sort of balkanized. They have they exist in many different departments. They're sort of the second and third rate intellectuals that sort of have to kind of create a kind of bandwagon that they make themselves indispensable to in order to make themselves sort of be important. That they are sort of holding some kind of arbitrary, sort of pseudo intellectual claim um, that's based on usually some kind of weird kind of external authority. It's not really reasoned from first principles. It's reasoned from some kind of reductive test, usually somewhere. That's how it kind of covers over its intellectual bad faith. But anyway, um, that this new, let's say, multipolar intellectual or culture, this multipolar cultural environment now is a kind of anathema to them, which has forced them to kind of step their game up and to manifest on a more macro scale, as it were. And this is more of a psychological war than it is anything else. This is an era of psychological politics. That's a phrase I've been trying to coin. It hasn't quite caught on. Um, and it's important that we grow sensitive to these sorts of themes as the actual cause of our problem, um, so that we can properly immunize our culture from these kinds of toxicities, and that we can see the signature of these psychologies at work in the kinds of ideological and political narratives that are being forwarded. Um, and the only way to keep, let's say, liberalism, authentic liberalism, alive is to continue to burn the torch, this all important torch of self-ownership and self-determinism, and how much space is that being given? And I'm afraid that to go back to the Bret Weinstein, the problem with Unity 2020 is that there is an important ideological distinction, at least between the right and the left. And I don't even know what the left even is supposed to represent. I mean, unless it's an actual purple synthesis, there is no such thing as sort of, you can't have a solution that's half right wing and half left wing. It just doesn't work, because the left is always going to say, well, this is a problem that needs to be addressed, and essentially the right wing perspective, and I think has a lot correct with it, is that perhaps no, that should actually, perhaps that should be a problem. Perhaps that we should not ameliorate every suffering, because not every suffering should be treated as a utilitarian disease. That perhaps this disease is the right disease to have, because it is a representation of the disease that the soul has, and merely trying to mask the symptoms of that diseased soul is not going to facilitate maturation and development and human progress. It's going to essentially inculcate and bake in yet further infantilism, and yet further a kind of an entrenched entitlement, which subverts, let's say, the human need to manifest a kind of self-ownership and self-determinism, where one can correlate one's own decisions and one's own responsibility and lack of responsibility with consequences. And dampening those consequences, in some sense, is to deride and derogate from the ambit of self-ownership and self-determinism and responsibility. And that is what responsibility is. Responsibility is the outward expression of reason. That our essentially the quality of our reasoning is manifest in the expression of responsibility as a social body, as a social entity, as a feeling body as well. That one's emotions are a reading of one's. Okay, let me not get too esoteric. Um, but essentially, what I'm saying is that we dilute and cheapen essentially the subjective navigational system of the human um, interface. We essentially we say, no, your emotions, you cannot use them to diagnose reality and yourself. You cannot use them to develop humility. Instead, don't trust your emotions. Trust an ideological narrative. Don't find and compute the answers to the questions. The answers to the questions are some kind of reductive outside phenomena that you don't have to sort of, I mean, this is the sort of, where is the source of the crisis? Where is the source? What is the problem with the world? And at some point, every answer that isn't me, that isn't I am the problem with the world, is the wrong answer. And that kind of radical bootstrapping, in some sense, might seem far-fetched, but there is so much that is thrown out, the baby with the bathwater, when that is not the answer that the soul is authentically capable of uttering and producing. Because why choose some parts of things that then you're responsible for and some parts that you're not responsible for. And if you're going to start this off in a piecemeal way, where do you think you're going to get to uh, when you're picking and choosing the things that you're responsible for? I mean, perhaps people will criticize me, but this is why I think that the proximate lever of actually producing any kind of real change is to blame people, because there is a lot of blame that I think people deserve to burden. That it's and blame really is a source of power. That if you cannot blame yourself, you cannot be empowered. Uh, uh, and if you're going to disempower yourself by failing to blame yourself, then there really is only you to blame. It's sort of but as soon as you sort of try to blame a kind of an outside entity, I mean, in some sense, right now, people might think, well, I'm just sound like a weird sort of hypocrite, or I'm being sort of strangely making a kind of a strange paradox. But in some sense, I'm blaming myself for not being able to get the message across to people about how they need to hold themselves to blame. That's my mentality right now, is that I have not been able to properly articulate a clear enough argument. I mean, that's what I blame myself for not being able to create a compelling enough and a persuasive enough um, sort of syllogistic, uh, uh, concrete uh, substantiation for the fact that you really do have to blame yourself for everything, and it's right that you do so. Um, Otherwise, you are functionally disempowering yourself. But it's also true. I mean, I'm not just saying that because it sounds like a clever thing to say. It also literally is true. And that's the difference between a kind of real radical fire, as it were, that's sort of accountable, that has it's actually doing that takes reasoning seriously. I mean, a lot of the time, I think this. I mean, I guess you could blame it on education, that there was that there is this real lack of sort of moral fiber, that there is such kind of ethical vacuousness, sort of that's all centered around kind of external locuses of control, and kind of resorting to a kind of like an external authority that will, that as long as you're in a kind of conformity to some symbolic external authority, that's good enough. The As long as you're orientating your life according to some set of external authorities, then you've always got cover, and you've always got. Um, I mean, this is why I also don't understand some of Brett's positions, because he gets a lot of the heart of what I'm saying, but then he still indulges in these reductive frameworks, and then essentially, he uses essentially this generalized computational computer that he has in his head. Okay, well, let me run this simulation. Let me run this. Well, we're talking about a group of people. Obviously, a group of people are going to have this kind of array of sentiments, and this kind of array of passions, and this kind of um, approximate thinking. And so, as I think about this generalized group of people and how they think about the rest of the world in generalizations, then we have to appease that kind of reductive thinking. And so let me put on a reductive framework to be in sympathy with their reductions. It's sort of, it's so, I mean, and then you end up undoing the core of what it is that you already understand, just to sort of appease this kind of, I guess, this common sense appeasement of what actually then becomes an external authority, um, of what practical thinking or something. And then you don't even realize that you become a sort of a mealy mouthed uh, collaborator with the cultural totalitarian ethos. I mean, I mean, in some sense, Bret tries to distinguish the things that he says, from how they say it, but I don't see so much of a distinction even when he does that. I mean, why are you sharing their jargon? I mean, you can try to piggyback their jargon to sort of maybe debunk it, or to sort of to show the ad absurdum. But I mean, the problem is that the objects that they are already referring to have woven into them toxic premises that are just. I mean, I go into some of those paradoxes in one of the 6 hour recordings. I guess it's not that easy to give a foray into it. I'm not going to rehash it now because it's a headache. But about the distribution of bad luck. It's a very mangled way of trying to dignify their complaint, because that test for racism is. I went through this in the last recording, so let me not give another superficial rundown of it. But essentially, you follow that logic. It's got tautologies in it. It's got holes in it. Um, it's got their whole ethos baked into it. It's poisonous. Okay, I guess I'm not going to say anything new, so I might as well stop this recording.